It is now my great honor to invite forward our guest darshan, our guest teacher for this morning, Rabbi Josh Weinberg, who is a member of CBE for a long time with his whole family. And he is also the president of ARTZA, which is the Association of Reform Zionists of America. And he's the vice president of the URJ, which is the Union for Reform Judaism, which is our reform movement. He is a friend, he is our teacher, and we're so very, very grateful that he's going to speak to us this morning about something that we really need to be paying attention to. So please, you've probably seen him around. Yashkach.
Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom. Shir le'ma'alot b'shuv Adonai et shivat Zion hayinu kecholmim. You know what? You okay? A song of ascents, we're told in the book of Psalms, that when God returned us to Zion, to Israel, hayinu kecholmim, we were like dreamers. You might recognize these words because they're the words that we say on Shabbat just before we offer thanks for our meals. When we stop and we think about this dream of returning to our ancestral land, and think about that this is actually relevant in the modern world, that 77 years ago and over 130 years ago, we returned to our land, and that dream was achieved by establishing a modern state. Some say that with the establishment of that modern state, the movement known as Zionism was, in fact, fulfilled and now over. But I'm not in that camp. And that's what I want to spend a few minutes with you this morning, and I'm so honored to have the invitation to speak this morning and to share a few words of Torah and a few words about Israel and Zionism and what this moment calls for us right now. I want to thank specifically Rabbi Colin and Cantor Breitzer, somewhere. Where'd he go? Yeah, there he is. Yeah, there he is. And by the way, you all should know that Cantor Breitzer is about to take on a very significant leadership role in our entire reform movement as he becomes the incoming president of the American Conference of Cantors. Okay, yeah, you should give it up for him. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sure we will all celebrate more later, but I want you to know that that's a big deal, and that he's coming from CBE and representing all of us, and taking a huge leadership moment on, and that's wonderful. Now, I want to share a little bit about my own journey, as I grew up just west of here in Chicago, and I was looking for my own identity, own Jewish identity, own Jewish expression, and I found it in Israel when I decided I'm going to live in Israel and make my life there. And upon arrival, I was looking for what is Zionism now? Is it enough just to live here and be part of the fabric of society? Or is there something else? And I quickly realized that my Zionism, my contribution, was not going to be in the form of high tech, and I wasn't going to be a farmer who went and drained the swamps like they did 100 years ago. I said, my contribution is going to be about changing what it means to be Jewish in the Jewish state. I said, I can help bring Reform Judaism to Israel. And I quickly realized that as much as I think Israel and the Jewish state needs liberal and Reform Judaism, I realized that Reform Judaism here also desperately needs Israel. And I had this experience that when I came back to the United States after over a decade in Israel, I was still practically fluent in English, having grown up here, but I felt like I was missing a few social cues. So, in the United States, what's a first question that people often ask you when you meet them for the first time? Close, what else? Yeah? Where are you from? Okay, those are good questions. That's not the question I would get right away. Yes, Joanna Pressman, exactly. What do you do? And I said, about what? And they said, no, what do you do? We'd like to try and encapsulate the very essence of your being by understanding your 9-to-5 job or what you do for a living. And I said, oh, okay, well, I'm the head of the Association of Reformed Zionists of America. Now, you know that scene in the movies when the record player screeches, someone says something and the record player screeches to a halt and there's an audible gasp and everyone turns to look at you and there's crickets in the background and everything? You're familiar? Well, that happened because someone said, well, and there's a true story, this actually happened. I don't think we know each other well enough to you have just used the Z word with me. And I said, oh, do you mean Zionist or Zionism? And they said, yes, we can't use that. And I said, well, is it possible that perhaps you and I, my conversation partner, you and I might have slightly different understandings or interpretations or even meanings or definitions of what this term means? And they said, well, I don't know, but I don't want to talk about it with you. I said, okay, that's really hard. I said, but allow me to take a few minutes of your time to explain to you what I mean by this and what my hope is that we as a reform movement stand for. Now, first of all, just how many of you have spent time in Israel in your lives before? And how many of you are what we would call repeat offenders, like you've been more than once? Yeah, okay. And how many of you have spent time in Israel at some point during this last year and a half since that tragic and fateful day of October 7th, 2023? I know some of you have gone quite often. We know that, of course, the country has changed drastically since that day. I think that Israelis are still not yet having put the P before the TSD. They're still very much in the trauma, not even yet in the post-trauma of what has happened. Now, a different question. How many of you have had a conversation about Israel in the last year and a half? I'm going to guess most of it. Yeah, a conversation. And how many of you have had a conversation with someone who is of a different generation than you? And how many of you felt after that conversation, well, that was lovely? And how many of you have said, wow, I don't want to do that again. That didn't feel good to me. And how many of you are concerned? How many of you are struggling? Yeah. It could be struggling internally, struggling with how we as a Jewish community are not always seeing eye to eye with one another, struggling with what's happening in Israel, struggling with what's happening in Gaza or in the West Bank, struggling with so many things, struggling with what's happening here in the United States as well. And how many of you have felt, gosh, I wish there was something else that I could do. I wish I could be a bit more active in this world and feel like I could contribute. I read a lot on social media and I even share and click and I, give money and donations and I try and do this. Anybody feeling like I wish there was something more? Well, good. Glad. Now, how many of you have voted so far in the World Zionist Congress elections? Okay. So you're the ones. Good. Don't worry. My good friend and colleague Blake, who's waving wildly, has made a note now of people who did not raise their hands. And he'll be standing at the door on the way out afterwards. Because this World Zionist Congress is not only a thing that you can do, it's a thing that actually really has impact in the world for the Jewish people and for the state of Israel. And my hope is that it's not just about funding or positions or organizational power and influence. It actually touches the core of our definition and our ability to reclaim Zionism for a 21st century liberal and progressive outlook. Now, I think that Zionism is about three things. Number one answers the call of the ancient Rabbi Hillel HaZaken, Hillel the elder, who said, first of all, Im ein ani li. He said, if I am not for myself. And the number one definition, in my opinion, of Zionism is that we have to be for ourselves. It's about collective responsibility, and that Kol Yisrael arevim ze lezeh, that all Jews are in fact responsible for one another, and we have the obligation to provide for our own security, to protect ourselves, and to create, in fact, a safe haven of those fleeing persecution, adversity, anti-Semitism. It was about creating a new Jew who could rise up and be strong and prevent ourselves from ever feeling a sense of vulnerability or powerlessness. It was about our physicality, about our goof, our bodies. And if Zionism was about I'll call it our Jewishness, our sense of protection, our sense of self, our bodies, number two, Zionism was also about our souls, our neshama. In fact, Zionism wasn't just about what we were running away from. It was equally about what we came to create. And here I want to say on a personal note, that was what attracted me to the land of Israel, to the state of Israel. It was about saying, wait a second, I want to live in a Jewish society where my holidays are the national holidays, where the ATM wishes you Shabbat Shalom on a Friday afternoon, where my language was our language, and where we lived in Jewish space and Jewish time, which doesn't mean being late, 10 minutes late to everything, okay? It meant that I wanted to live in this majority culture. Right? Well, we had the chance to create something. I recently argued with a colleague this week who said, I bet there are more people either in New York City or in Boston, more people who are doing advanced degrees in Jewish studies than in Israel. I said, I don't know, that may be, but I said, I bet there are more 6-year-olds in Israel who can read the Bible in the original. I said, wow, there's something that we're creating there that is exciting. And not only that, but in fact, it is our reform movement who is reimagining what it means to be Jewish in the Jewish state. You see, Israelis have woken up to this reality where the polarizing dichotomy between religious, or read Orthodox, and secular no longer answers the needs of the mainstream. And after 77 years, almost, we've come to the conclusion that having a Jewish state doesn't necessarily mean having a Jewish community. And in addition to the age-old model where Israel was in the center, and we said, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, from out of Zion, out of Israel, will come Torah. And it's our job as diaspora communities to fund them or advocate on behalf of the state. I think we have something to offer far beyond that. Just look around you. Just look around at the amazing community that you've created right here, of the building that we have, of the staff and clergy that we have, of the program that we offer. And we did all of that, and we continue to do all that, without support from the government. And that's the model that we are actively working to export and to share with our Israeli friends who are looking also for meaning and community. And that's what we need to start building. And that's why it's our reform movement who week in and week out shows up on a Saturday night in the center of Tel Aviv at a square that has now been known as Kikar HaChatufim, or Hostage Square, and leads almost the entire cross-section of Israeli society in that ceremony known as Havdalah, where we differentiate between Shabbat and the rest of the week. And they would say, no, our Judaism is okay to bring into the public sphere. Just like sometimes on Simchat Torah or on Purim, we go out and we take to the streets. Well, they're saying also, they're saying our Judaism in the middle of Tel Aviv is about having women rabbis show up and teach Torah and lead tefillah. And it's about saying we are an inclusive body that brings together people from all over the world, from across every section of Israeli life. And that's what Zionism is too. It's about answering that second question of Hillel, who asked, Mili, who are we in fact? And so if number one is about our protection, our security, our being. Number two is about our souls and what it means to be Jewish. In fact, about Judaism. What's number three? Number three is about asking that last question that Hillel poses, Uchsha'ani la'atzmi ma'ani. If I am only for myself, what am I? You see, students of Jewish history, we will know that most of our Jewish law, most of the canon of our Jewish bookshelf was written during a time in which we did not have our own sovereignty. It was written in a time when we were guests at the whim of the non-Jewish or Gentile hosts, in which we were often vulnerable and often powerless. Which means that now in this 77-year-old reality in which we are now the sovereigns, we are now the ones with power, we now must be judged on how we treat the other, how we treat those who are powerless, those who are vulnerable, those who are in a minority, and those who find themselves under our rule, whether according to their will or whether against it. If Zionism is about having power, we also must quote the great sage, you know who's coming, Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, who reminds us that with great power comes great responsibility. And that we as a society must be judged not only by how well we can protect ourselves and how well we can use our own power, but out of the fear that power may be abused. And that's scary. But also that is part and parcel of what it means to have our own state. And if we just look at the news of the past week, in which the state of Israel passed its budget, narrowly avoiding a collapse of the government, took one step into dismantling the balance of power, which is the foundation of democracy, and also put the reality in front of people's faces as the cover of this week's Musaf of Haaretz, this week's special edition to the Haaretz. Think like the Sunday New York Times magazine, like that. Showed on its cover a picture of 300 children who were killed this week in Gaza. A very, very difficult reality in which we must balance our own needs. I know that's how I felt when I was reading it. We must balance our own needs for protection and also balance the power that we inflict upon others. And in fact, this moment in time in our calendar is so incredibly poignant to point out these two sides of the coin. As we mentioned this morning, we are here during Shabbat HaChodesh, in which tomorrow we'll announce the month of Nisan, which means that we are exactly right in the middle between our two holidays that both start with the Hebrew letter Pei. We are 2 weeks after Purim and just 2 weeks before Pesach. Don't get worried, you'll have time to clean. It'll be okay. And my teacher, Yossi Klein Halevi, offers an important lesson. He says, because Jewish history speaks to our generation in the voice of these two biblical commands, both of them are to remember. The first voice is the voice of Purim that commands us now that the tribe of Amalek, or reminds us that the tribe of Amalek, who Haman is a descendant of, attacked us without provocation while we were wandering in the desert. It's of course echoed in our Haggadah, in our Haggadot of Pesach, when we say, Vehi she'amda, shelo achad bilvad kam aleinu lechalutenu, that not just one nation, every generation, a different person rises up to destroy us. He said, this is the command, don't be naive. He said, we have a commandment that we don't have the luxury of letting our guard down. How many of you are feeling this a little bit as we see what's happening around us, and we see what's happening where people are now a little bit more fast to hide Jewish symbols or not be openly Jewish on the streets, even here in New York and around the world, actually. But he says the second voice is that of Pesach, which commands us, as Cantor Breitzer and our cantorial intern Leslie sang so beautifully, that in every generation we have to remind ourselves that we, in fact, were slaves in the land of Egypt. And that voice is a voice telling us, don't be brutal. Don't be harsh and don't be barbaric, because you, of all people, should remember those moments when you were enslaved, when other people were acting with brutality towards you, and when you had no power. And this is exactly the balance that I would like us to think about what it means to be a Zionist. Now, here's our command that we get from another pay word, and that is our weekly parsha in Pekudei. When we're told at the beginning, just in the section that was prior to what we read this morning, which in fact lays out the foundation of our civilization, in that we are all asked to be counted. We are all asked, well, in the Torah it says every male over the age of 20, okay? And which I'm so glad that in our modern world we have enlightened into the world of egalitarianism, and when we say everyone should be counted, they're asked to give 1/2 shekel. Okay? Now, I always was curious about how they had pocket change wandering in the desert, having come just from Egypt. But never mind. We're asked to each person, each household, be counted to represent a collective whole, to do something together. Now, I did the math, and accounting for inflation over these last 4,000 years or so, and I realized that the 1/2 shekel today is exactly worth $5. Okay, I'm just kidding, I didn't know. However, when the Zionist movement was reinstated, or was instated in the end of the 19th century, about 128 years ago, they said, let's do the same thing as we did in the book of Exodus and then again later in the book of Numbers, where we said, let's institute this 1/2 shekel. We're asking each person to rise up and be counted and contribute just a little bit to be a member, to say, I want to have my voice heard. And that's what we're asking you to do today. It happens once every 5 years. And we're asking you to take a minute. Yes, it costs $5, which you can do after Shabbat if you feel more comfortable. And say, I want to be counted according to my tribe. Now, let me remind you what is at stake here. Because these are the same institutions created by Theodore Herzl in 1897 And the reason, even though we have a state now, the reason they're still here is because we of the diaspora community said, no, we want to have a seat at the table. And we want to make sure that we are in fact represented. Because you see, our reform movement, our 54 congregations, our Israel Religious Action Center that represents us and advocates on behalf of our rights, well, they are funded significantly through these institutions, the Jewish Agency, the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish National Fund. So much so that when I sat with our director of Iraq yesterday, Orly Erez-Lechovsky, she said she was very worried and said, you know, if you don't get the entire reform movement to vote, that's like a death knell for our reform movement in Israel. And I said, I know. And I want to make sure that you know. Because what else is at stake is that the ultra-Orthodox parties have woken up. And even though their Rebbis and their leaders are telling them that we are not a Zionist movement, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, they're saying, no, we have this opportunity to weaken the reform movement. That's why we're entering into this field. That's why we're jumping into the arena here. And in fact, in their publication ahead of Pesach, they used the same phrase that I quoted you earlier, where they said, Lo achad bilvad kam aleinu lechadultenu, that in every generation someone is rising up to destroy us. And in this generation, that is the reform movement. Because they allow for such things as women to be rabbis, and they welcome in the LGBTQ plus community. And they are an irrelevant movement in Jewish life today. Are we an irrelevant movement in Jewish life today? Are we? So what are we going to do about it? Right? And what more is that they said, and some of our ultra-nationalist movements said, if we gain control, if we get more votes than everyone else, we are going to use these institutions, specifically the Jewish National Fund, to succinctly fulfill our agenda of expanding settlements in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, and leading to a de facto annexation. In April of 2021, our leader of the reform movement, Yair Lutstein, who's also a vice chair of Kakal, or the Jewish National Fund, held up a newspaper headline that said, Joe Biden, he was the president then, if you remember, and said, Joe Biden had never heard of Kakal until yesterday, because what they were trying to do had specific geopolitical ramifications. My friends, that's how high the stakes are. And once in every 5 years, you have an opportunity to do something about it. Yes, you have to be 18 years or older. And yes, I've gotten some questions about this. Some of the requirement of these elections is that we ask people to vote who identify as Jewish. The thing is, it's a self-identification. There are no questions asked. And we at CBE are inclusive of everyone. You heard it in our mission statement earlier. And those are the rules. And we're trying to send our people to represent us. Did you know that if you vote, you can send Rabbi Rachel Timoner, Cantor Josh Breiser, Rose Snitz, and our other members, Rabbi Leora Kay, Joanne Mort, you could send them to represent you to Jerusalem to advocate for our values. Friends, I ask you to do this just once, and ask you to find out everyone in your network who can come and join us. And I want to end with the sentence the verse that we say every morning in our tefillah. And I say that it's sometimes easy to wring our hands, but I'm asking you to roll up your sleeves and to get involved and to help bring an or chadash al Zion, to help bring a new light upon Zion, and to help us do it together. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.